All right, Jim, do you want to get started?
Yeah, let's go.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome. This is a webinar style panel discussion we are hosting titled Future of Traffic, Envisioning Multimodal Transportation in the DC region. Wendy, could you go to the next slide, please? So here's today's agenda. Right up front, I want to kind of notify everyone that we are recording this session, and I'm not sure how we're gonna kind of upload this, but hopefully we'll be able to share it to folks who have registered for today's event but are not able to join us today. But anyway, here's today's agenda. We'll have a brief welcome message and a background about APBP and our local chapter, followed by presentation by Andy Clark, kind of framing the discussion that we're going to have today about major themes and issues. After that, we'll have the main panel discussion. We've separated it into two parts. Kind of the first part of the discussion will focus on the COVID pandemic era and how different organizations have reacted to the pandemic. And in the second part of the discussion, we'll be talking about how the post-pandemic future looks like in terms of transportation. In the end, we'll have a question and answer session. For questions, please use the Q&A box at the bottom. There's a separate chat box. We don't recommend you to use the chat box because we will not be monitoring it. Feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box throughout the discussion today. Depending on the nature of the question, some of the hosts or panelists might answer immediately, or we could kind of get to the questions during the Q&A session at the end. Could you go to the next slide, please, Wendy? So again, welcome. As I said, this event is organized by APBP's National Capital Region chapter, the local DC chapter. APBP, as many of you would know, stands for Association of Pedestrian Bicycle Professionals. It's a professional organization, a community of practitioners working to create more walkable, bikeable places. We foster peer knowledge sharing, advanced technical expertise, and support the professional development of our members. This event is organized by the local chapter, which was founded in 2014. The local chapter is led by two co-chairs. I'm one of the co-chair, and Caitlin Milner is another co-chair who's on the call today. And then we also have a steering committee that's open to all members. And steering committee meets bi-monthly to plan events like this one. Go to the next one, please. So here are today's hosts. I'm Aditya Inamdar. I'm the APBP DC co-chair. I'm from Kittleson & Associates. We're joined today by Andy Clark, who is one of the APBP founding members, and with Tool Design, who'll be presenting today. Then Caitlin Milner, who is also DC chapter co-chair, and Sheila Borker from Tool Design. They will be moderating the two sessions. And then finally, we have Jim and also Wendy that will be monitoring the question and answers for the Q&A session. Next slide, please. So here's a list of today's panelists. We're joined by Alex Baca, Housing Program Organization for Greater Washington, Linda Bailey, Vision Zero Director at District Department of Transportation at DDOT, George Brannion, Active Transportation Branch Manager at DDOT. George had a conflict, so he said he might be able to join a little later. And we have Allison Davis, Director of Strategic Planning at WMATA, Siba El Samra, Urban Mobility Associate at World Resource Institute, Lauren Hassel, Safe Routes to School Coordinator at Arlington, Hannah Han, Deputy Director of Policy at Montgomery County DOT, Andrew Mees, Systems Performance Planning at MWCOG, Heidi Mitter, NOAA, District Park and Ride Lot and Bicycle Pedestrian Coordinator at VDOT. Next slide, please. So we have two poll questions for all the attendees today. Question one is, who do you work for? And we have several options here: federal government, local government, regional government organizations like NPO or COG, advocacy organizations, research organization, consulting firm, students, or any other. So if you could please take the poll, it'll kind of help the panelists understand who we have in the audience today. We'll probably give 30 seconds. Wendy?
Yep, we're at about 82%, so we'll leave it open for another second or two.
Okay. All right, so here are the results. We have 44% from who are members of a consulting firm, about 17% from local government, and 10% each from federal and regional governments. That's great. Can we move to the next question, Wendy? So the next question is, who do you work with? Is it the same one? Sorry. All right, here we go. So the next question, we want to kind of understand the geography of where our attendees are listening in today. So where are you from? DC, Alexandria, Arlington County, Fairfax County, Montgomery County, Prince George's County, Baltimore, elsewhere in the DMV region or outside the region. So again, we'll give it a few seconds before we close the poll. All right, so 37% are from DC, 12% from Arlington County, 7% each from Fairfax and Montgomery County, and 2% from Prince George's County. Well, thank you so much. And I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andy for his presentation.
Great, thank you. So my name is Andy Clark. I'm the Director of Strategy for Tool Design and an early member of APBP and have been a staff member for APBP, played a variety of roles. Very happy to be here. Really appreciate the invitation. When I hear the phrase, the future of traffic, I think of a presentation I heard several years ago by a guy called Todd Lippman at the Victoria Transport Policy Institute, Columbia. And he would ask his audience, what's been the greatest innovation or the most transformational thing in transportation in the last 50 years? And the answers would usually come up with some Jetsons-like image of flying cars or jetpacks or World Fair images of space-age transportation or maglev pods. And he would take great delight in suggesting, next slide, that actually the biggest change is putting wheels on a suitcase. Putting small rubber wheels on the bottom of your luggage has been a transformative experience for the transportation world. And as someone who has traveled more than 1.5 million miles on United Airlines, I can attest to the value of that. And there can be a little question that travel patterns have changed dramatically as a result of the pandemic. Having flown that many miles in previous years, it's shocking to me to realize that I haven't been on a plane for more than a year. In many US cities, especially the DC area, airline traffic all but stopped for several months and is not yet back to anything close to pre-pandemic levels. I live in Richmond now, and I rode Amtrak and Metro from Richmond to Silver Spring at least twice a week for 2 years before the pandemic. I haven't been on a train for more than a year. Public transportation ridership fell precipitously over that period and is still struggling to recover. You were right, Wendy. You should go to the next slide. There's a variety of different measures that show us, that confirm that dramatic drop in traffic and travel and activity. Next slide. I have left the Commonwealth of Virginia precisely once since the pandemic hit. And up and down the East Coast, traffic fell by 90+% almost overnight and is still at probably half the level that it was before the pandemic. And the results were pretty extraordinary. Next slide. In Richmond, I particularly noticed an extraordinary sense of quiet and calm that came over the streets in the immediate aftermath of the lockdown. People had time. The 30 to 60 minutes each way of commuting that they used to have to do every day was no longer part of their routine. Sadly, either because they may have lost their job, but mostly because they were working from home. Across the globe, cities found their air cleaning almost overnight. Greenhouse gas emissions fell dramatically in ways we could only dream of in normal circumstances. People were out walking and biking in their neighborhoods, and trail canners around the region show anywhere between 50 to 300% increases in trail use in the period after the lockdown. Of course, there are also some unintended or unexpected consequences. That delightful absence of motor vehicle traffic enabled drivers to go that much faster on the open road. Fatal and serious injury crashes haven't fallen the way we could have anticipated. I gather there was a story in the Washington Post today on just that topic. In Richmond, at least, the sound of street racing could be heard at almost all hours. We realized actually just how poor our pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure is, especially when trying to keep a safe distance from people. And whether we were fortunate enough to be working or not, we were all making a lot more local trips closer to home. By coincidence, during that period, we happened to be working on projects in Bowie, Maryland and Tysons, Virginia in the fall of last year. In Tysons, the absence of tens of thousands of daily car commuters left wide open streets almost begging to be rebalanced. While in Bowie, as in other suburban areas, traffic fell much less precipitously as people discovered the transportation system there has locked them into driving even for very short trips and even for errands that could be made by foot or by bike if the built environment supported it. And as people have parsed the data and debated the short and long-term impacts of the pandemic since then, I think there are a few different lessons that we can learn. Number one, there have been dramatic changes that will stick. People working from home is clearly one of those changes. Not only does that mean much less pronounced morning and afternoon peaks, but it also totally rewrites the story around trip chaining, as people are no longer wedded to their cars for the school run, on the way to work, or errands on the way home. And I see that as a great opportunity. Second, the pandemic has not so much changed things as highlighted things that were already true or already happening. The danger of speeding on overbuilt roads, for example, was always there. Now we see it more clearly. Commuting trips were already less than 1 in 5 of all the trips people make, and yet all of our models and surveys focus heavily, if not exclusively, on the journey to work as the measure. Short and local trips were always important. I think that was made even more evident in the pandemic era. Third, the pre-pandemic normal wasn't actually that great. We now better understand the massive inequities caused by racist transportation, housing, land use, and other policies, and the unjust health and safety and access and other outcomes that resulted from those policies. 4-foot wide sidewalks, shared lane arrows, 8-foot wide trails, they were inadequate before the pandemic, they still are. And fourth, it turns out that much of the data and the modeling and the tools that we use for forecasting and predicting the future and the engagement we undertake to determine the future of traffic is limited. It's limiting and is riven with bias. Some of our local agencies, just to take one example, are preparing to widen I-495, 95, and 270 on assumptions and models that were probably skewed before the pandemic and look kind of foolish today. Relying on the journey to work as our primary measure is wrong in so many levels. Obviously, it's skewed towards suburban, white, middle-aged males, even more so after the pandemic with the changes in employment that we've seen. So what of the future? I would respectfully suggest that we don't want to return to normal and that we can't use old methods of measurement to determine and dictate our path forward. We must choose our future and establish a local and regional vision centered around people that's carbon neutral, involves no deaths, provides access and opportunity for all, and where the future of traffic is not an end in itself, but a tool to achieve much higher goals. And to help us get started, I have a tool that is probably just as prosaic as wheeled luggage, in the realm of future transportation things. Next picture. Now, you all know probably that I'm a bike guy at heart, so you might expect me to choose a fancy elevated roundabout floating in the air like the Hoven Ring in Eindhoven in the Netherlands. Next slide. Or perhaps a 10,000 space automated underground garage just for bicycles as the solution that I have in mind. But no, instead I commend to you, next picture, the raised sidewalk. The future of transportation planning and design is this. Now, why would I say that? Next picture. Because a simple solution that has very little technical challenge involved is a not so subtle way to change priorities and to change the way we think about traffic. Now, at the moment, I think we would all say that we want quiet streets, safe local residential roads in which people can walk and bike safely, and that at the moment, car traffic probably moves too fast in that space. There's a way to slow it down, and that's to make sure that as soon as you turn off the main road, you have to cross a speed hump, you have to cross a threshold into a residential area. Today, we most likely would say we can't do that because traffic would have to slow down to make that turn onto the side street. And I would say, yes, and that's the expectation we should have, and we should force a change in the way we think about our main roads and major roads and arterial corridors so that we can achieve this kind of solution. It's a, again, not so subtle way of just changing priorities and determining that people traveling in local streets safely at lower speeds is the goal that we're looking for and is the future of traffic. Next slide. By way of conclusion, I would encourage you to add to your probably extensive lockdown reading list. There's a new book that's available in good bookstores and probably online, which captures a lot of the stories about the sustainable future around the globe that I hope we can take to heart as we discuss the future of traffic today. So with that, I hope I've done my job in framing the issues. I hope I haven't stolen too many of the good stats and arguments and stories you are all going to tell. I'm looking forward to the conversation. And I believe our MC for questions is Caitlin.
Yes, thank you, Andy. Hi, everyone. My name is Caitlin Mildner. As Aditya mentioned, I serve alongside him as co-chair of the APBP chapter here in the DC region. And first, I'm going to go around and have all the panelists first introduce themselves and talk about how their agency is involved in multimodal transportation. And feel free to comment on Andy's great presentation we had. I have a list. We'll go alphabetically just to keep things organized. So I have Alex Baca up first.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. And thanks, Andy, for a really thorough presentation that answered some questions that I had about how things are working lately. So I work for Greater Washington. Many of you might be familiar with our publication, which has been around for about 13 years at this point, which is crazy to think about. We've been writing about transportation, land use, and housing in the DC region since 2008. Mostly as a volunteer-based contributor structure. I do advocacy. My title actually just switched to policy manager from housing program organizer. So I'm working on both housing and transportation. It's great to work for an advocacy organization that allows us to address both to keep them from being siloed. And my particular focus is the sort of land use policies that influence both transportation and housing and how all that stuff intersects. So, thank you to those of you who read our site, and for those of you who have contributed. There's often sometimes contributors on calls, and I love it when people have been engaged with us. But I, primarily spend a lot of my time working with the DC Council and relevant agencies to sort of push forward a pro-housing, pro-transportation agenda that does sort of rest on increased residential density to allow people increased access to services.
Great, thank you, Alex. Next, I have Allison Davis.
Hello, and thanks again for putting this together. I'm Allison Davis, Director of Strategic Planning at Metro. And so underneath myself, my team, we do a lot of the long range planning. So we just finished up bus transformation project last year, luckily, right before the lockdown and everything that happened. But we also are doing, some of the corridor projects looking at, and this touches to something that Andy had said, or one of the questions of, challenges that we saw in the past, in the before times, as we call them. Are those capacity issues? Is that crowding? Is that going to come back? Do we need to be planning? It's still moving forward on that. And then finally, we also have the bike, a lot of the bike ped planning around our stations, and trying to look beyond Title VI in terms of equity and really be pushing what the agency, what our role is in really overcoming a lot of the long-term inequities about transportation in this region. So look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. All right, Andrew Meese.
Good afternoon, Andrew Meese, Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. I work as the Systems Performance Planning Director in the Department of Transportation Planning, part of the staff to the National Capital Region Transportation Planning Board, which is the federally designated metropolitan planning organization for Washington, D.C. and vicinity. We have a staff of about 60, so my team is part of that. We work on a number of elements of metropolitan planning that include bicycle and pedestrian, traffic safety, transportation security, regional public transportation, technology, and operations. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Hannah Henn. Oh, I think you're still muted, Hannah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hannah Henn here from Montgomery County Department of Transportation. I was recently appointed Deputy Director for Transportation Policy. Up until this point, I've been at the county for about 5 years. I had been leading strategic innovation, and I was temporarily filling in on our communications when COVID hit. So I had quite an exciting time leading communications during COVID. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Heidi Mitter.
Hi, everyone. My name is Heidi Mitter. I work for VDOT in the Northern Virginia district. Our district covers the geographic locations of Loudoun, Fairfax, Prince William County, and Arlington County. VDOT plans, delivers, operates, and maintains the majority of the roadways in Virginia. That includes bicycle and pedestrian facilities. We do a lot of coordination with statewide agencies, our sister agency, the Department of Rail and Public Transportation. We work with localities, local jurisdictions in the region on planning and delivering projects, and do a lot of coordination on transit and transportation demand management programs as well. Glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go on to Lauren Hassel.
Hi, everyone. Lauren Hassel, Arlington Public Schools Safe Routes to School Coordinator. I work with schools, facilities, and operations department in multimodal transportation planning through a grant from VDOT that we've had for a number of years. And initially we were part of teaching and learning or instruction. Just in the last 2.5 years or so, I've been part of transportation planning, and I come at it from a very different angle. I'm more of a communications and outreach person, but I've learned a lot. I work with Kristen Haldeman, who some of you may know very well, who would like to have been with you today, but is busy getting ready for reopening in a matter of weeks, as we all are. And here we have 28,000 students, and we're the second largest employer in Arlington. So our impact on the transportation infrastructure is huge. And our biggest goal in these times and before and after is minimizing the number of cars going to and from our campuses and the mini rush hours that result from that kind of transportation. Oh, and I was just going to say about Andy's presentation, I think I really liked the simple solutions like wheeled luggage and raised sidewalks, and sometimes like the clutter of every day. can be moved away with a pandemic, and we can see kind of the simple things that are there all along and that we can use and without costing a lot of money or requiring a lot of meetings. So thanks for that, Andy.
Thank you, Lauren. Linda Bailey.
Hi, I'm Linda Bailey with DDOT, Vision Zero Director. I've been with DDOT for about almost 2 years now, and we're doing a lot of big projects in the district. And part of the goal of Vision Zero is to try and look anew at our road safety program, which has been existing for a long time, and trying to kind of refresh it and look for innovative ways to change things. I wouldn't say they're innovative, but raised sidewalks are something we still don't do very much of. We are raised crosswalks, I should say. And things like that, trying to make them more standard part of our portfolio. During COVID, my group has led several COVID-related things, which will be coming.
Thank you, Linda. And last but not least, we have Siba El Samra. Are you here with us?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I tend to turn off my camera just to make sure my connection is working. Thank you everyone for putting this together. I'm happy to join. Siba El Samra. I'm an Urban Mobility Associate at the World Resources Institute, specifically at the Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. I work within the Health and Road Safety group. So we focus basically on different aspects of road safety, from speed management to safe infrastructure. We work around the world. We have offices in around 60 cities around the world. We work with cities and governments to support them in implementing safe infrastructure and creating speed plans and other plans to implement. We also work on, we have a number of publications on these different issues, sustainability, speed management, etc. And I want to thank Andy for his presentation. I totally agree that the normal wasn't that great. I think we might end up getting back there. Maybe not right now, but soon enough, because everyone is eager to get back to work. If we don't change anything, we will get back to the not so great normal, unless we invest with them in the momentums that we've seen in the past year. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll move into our panel discussion portion of this webinar. And I'm going to go through a few questions related to multimodal transportation in the COVID era. And each of the questions will be directed at a group of individuals, just to kind of keep things moving and get everyone the chance to speak and weigh in. So our first question we have is directed at Heidi, Hannah, Linda, and Lauren. So if you all just want to jump in. It's a multi-part question. What needs has your agency identified related to travel during COVID? And how has it responded to those needs?
I'll jump in with the schools aspect, because that probably is the most precise. With us, our biggest issue was school buses and the reduced capacity on school buses, and going from 30 to 60 kids, depending on the size, to 11. Presented a lot of challenges, and again, not wanting to put all those kids in a constant cycle of busing throughout the day and never having them get to school with a limited fleet and so on. We turned to other means like expanding our walk zones, which then leads to additional needs like additional crossing supports and needs for audits and evaluations and so on. But then kind of creative tools like trying to form walking school buses, creating special maps, getting students involved during the time they were at home in actually planning their own commutes and looking at their sidewalks and looking at the infrastructure and turning it into kind of a learning experience. And then the other aspect that was really important was when you have a number of people coming to the same place at the same time, all different ages, all different needs, but all needing to be tested or screened before they enter the school building. How to negotiate that, both getting on the bus for the bus riders and getting into the building for those who are walking, biking, and then, yes, being dropped off, and making sure that parents know that they have to stick around and that sort of thing. So it was definitely a lot of behavior change that we hope will result over the short term, that maybe some of these expanded walk zones will stay that way. Maybe there will be, because of the outdoor time young people have had in the interim, that maybe they will be more inclined to do so, not just to go to and from school, but to do all their commuting. But yeah, so we basically had to pivot and change up our dependence on the buses and try to find creative ways to turn that into active transportation.
Lauren's answer reminded me from VDOT kind of a couple situations that arose similar. With drive-through testing, there are some testing sites that had a lot of traffic issues. You know, tons and tons of people were all descending upon a site, and I know VDOT had to help manage traffic for that. And we got a lot of requests to use our commuter lots for distribution of food and other things related to, you know, the hard times that people have been having with the economy and COVID-related things. That's kind of on the zoomed in level. On the overall level, I think COVID highlighted that a lot of people's transportation needs didn't necessarily change due to COVID. People, you know, buses still need to run, trucks still need to deliver goods. You know, people still need to get to work, and people, you know, even more so need to get out to bike and walk for their health and sanity. A lot of us experience. So I think it highlighted that, you know, things, you know, transportation needs don't stop. They keep on going day in, day out, whether it's a pandemic, a snowstorm, or any of those situations. So I think resiliency, you know, and continuity of operations is really highlighted with COVID.
I'll jump in with a few things. So we early on did some specific COVID-related changes. We created sidewalk extensions and some pinch points, especially near stores where people were queuing on the sidewalk, to allow people to pass away from others, like at least 6 feet apart. That is a pretty heavy lift to do some of those things, and I would say that those were a good early thing, but I think people have gotten more comfortable with being outdoors since then in terms of our knowledge of this illness and the ease with which what people think are the primary locations where the virus is transmitted. And then the other big thing we did is we have one of the biggest slow street programs in the country. We have about 26 miles of slow streets that are signed right now and are out. And those have been really interesting to put in and also kind of challenging. I'll say in transportation, we love set it and forget it. These are not set it and forget it arrangements. They're things that anybody can move, or most people can move. So we have some very engaged citizens, sometimes moving them. So we have to kind of manage that. And of course, things in the street sometimes get hit and destroyed. So we have to have a big maintenance there. So it's been an interesting process. I think that DC especially is kind of divided into work from home and still going to work, and dealing with a very stressful situation, I think, for everyone, and a lot of anxiety and concern. And I think that we're still kind of grappling with how can we do these kind of projects in a more equitable way, and meaningfully, equitably, meaning like how are we kind of assessing the real needs, not just of transportation, but other things, and then dealing with the city. So that remains an ongoing.
I can add onto the slow streets topic. I oversaw the creation of, in Montgomery County, we call it a shared streets initiative. So we have temporary neighborhood greenways, which are similar to the slow streets. We also oversaw the closing of streets to facilitate outdoor dining and retail activity. And we pivoted traditionally we have a block party permit program, and we adapted that program to be a shared streets block permit. So not for parties, but we, in addition to the areas that we have in place for the longer term, anybody anywhere in the county on a county road can request 3 to 4 days to have their street designated for local traffic only for additional outdoor space. And that program is free and on demand. And we run the Ride on Bus system, which is the second largest bus operation after Metrobus in the region. We, as many transit operators have done, but we were one of the first to implement rear door boarding. We required face masks on board before the state required it, and we were the first in the region to have free masks available on every bus. That was certainly a need that we quickly identified, and similar to what Lauren was saying, our capacity changes, it was really dramatic. Although we were able to keep buses on the road, the changes in our preferred capacity on the buses was a really dramatic change. And we adapted to that by having our extra buses stationed at metro stations along the Red Line, so that any point in time, if any bus reached capacity, there would always be spare buses stationed nearby ready to deploy. Also, just one thing I want to mention, in terms of a need, one thing that I would say we identified is, or I personally identified, is a need for more collaboration among agencies and quick ways to share ideas. And that was really one of the best parts of this experience, has been developing relationships. And I think we are much more nimble in terms of collaborative approaches going forward.
Thank you all for providing your insight on that. That was really informative. I'm going to move on to our next question. And this one is directed at just individuals who work at DOTs, so kind of open-ended. To what extent has your organization considered the disproportionate impacts of COVID on people of color, essential workers, and/or people with lower incomes? And how did it respond to those specific needs?
I'll jump in and say that, I mentioned that we provided free masks right away for our Shared Streets program. We did a ranking process where we developed metrics related to locations in equity emphasis areas. We looked at the percentage of zero-car households, income levels, population density, access to parks, and that is how we prioritize which areas from the master plan we would implement our shared streets first.
And this can be open-ended. If anyone wants to weigh in, they can.
Also, bike share, and this is really throughout the region for everybody representing a DOT here, Capital Bike Share implemented free rides for essential workers and $1 rides at other times. And I think a really important part about that is that Capital Bike Share is open 24 hours a day. And a lot of the other transit services reduced hours during the pandemic. So for essential workers, that was a 24-hour-a-day opportunity.
So we had think into a little different aspect. We're still putting together a report on this, but we are looking at COVID era crash data. Part of what we saw during the COVID period is that the same safety patterns that we see normally were exacerbated. Crash severity went up a lot in our lower income wards. And we lost more people. Our fatalities were the highest they've been since 2008, 2007 in the district last year now. And that relates, we are looking at the causes, but it looks like it's mainly speeding and speed at time of impact, because overall our crashes went down by about a third, reported crashes, but our fatalities went up significantly from the previous year. So, so we're looking at the equity impacts of that kind of underlying, like as Andy had mentioned, the overbuilt roads, specifically in those neighborhoods, and the lack of options in some cases that we can ameliorate with projects. And we were able to happily accelerate projects, especially those where there's typically a maintenance of traffic, pause in construction during rush hour, basically. And so we were able to accelerate projects like our safety improvements on MLK, Ward 8.
I'll say for Metro, one of our, like, first and foremost, we were focused on our frontline employees who are majority people of color. And so, you know, it was interesting almost a year ago, as everything was shutting down and we were definitely scaling back service. And there was a lot of frustration, right, in the public as to, like, how are people going to get around, right? But, you know, we were really, you know, if we were to lose employees, then we're never able to ramp back up service, right? So we really had to set up a system. We created like A/B schedules for bus operators, train operators, maintenance workers, so that they were fully separate. But then that therefore reduced our capacity in the first couple of months. And so those are no longer operational, but that was something that we did from the get-go, because we really recognized the importance of their protection. But then, you know, as everyone knows, our budget has ping-ponged all over the place. And so, you know, as the budget has become clearer, and as we've, you know, gotten CARES Act and whatever the December stimulus name was, that has really allowed us to focus on, you know, like, we are using the data that we have to really figure out, you know, where the service that we're running, where it should be, because we're seeing, especially now, you know, bus ridership is more than twice what we're seeing on the railroad. And that is the complete opposite of what it was beforehand. And so the importance of bus is definitely, I think, well understood at all levels. And that wasn't always necessarily the case. So I think that's another place that we're seeing, like, who is continuing to ride, and it's higher minority riders and higher low income than even in the before times. So just kind of recognizing that and continuing to put service out where they need it.
I guess if I could pipe up for COG, you know, we want to be very sensitive to the pandemic has wrought many tragedies, but our eyes are wide open on terms of what we can observe, what data that we can compile, because we want to strengthen our planning and our implementation. So as COG, we've been trying to compile, you know, data from a variety of sources on a variety of aspects, you know, economy, health, transportation, to try to paint a regional picture. And, you know, this is good in itself, you know, we do this somewhat, but we can always do more and better, and that's informative. Of course, some data are more readily available than others. Some come sooner than others. So some of the probing questions that you know, people like this panel will ask, it unfortunately takes longer. Yeah, it may be easier for an individual agency to, you know, which has its own data, than to try to put, you know, dozens of data sources together. So that's something we do. We do have, you know, we can look at our data in terms of things like Hannah mentioned the equity emphasis areas that the Transportation Planning Board has defined in the region to look for geography of effects. There's also American Community Survey. We have the information on where workers in certain, you know, in certain working classifications live, and, you know, that's another piece of geography. And I would say, in terms of equity impacts, there's, you know, people are perhaps quick to think that telework has wrought a, you know, a significant reduction in traffic, and it has, but don't forget the unemployment rate has gone up significantly as well, and the tourism has gone down significantly as well, and, you know, maybe other social type activities. So, you know, there's more to the story than just telework. So those are some of the things that I wanted to bring up. I think, you know, we're probably not as willing to lean forward and predict what the future is going to be like because of COVID, but we are trying to compile as much data as we can.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone. I think we're going to switch now to our panel on the post-COVID discussion. And we've been receiving some questions in our Q&A box, and we will address those at the end. I'll just encourage everyone to continue posting your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those at the end. Now I will pass things over to Sheila.
Thanks so much, Caitlin, and thanks to all of our panelists who have spoken so far. I've enjoyed hearing you all kind of talk about what you've been doing and set the stage about what we do already know about COVID, but of course, we also want to talk about our expectations for the future, maybe our hopes for the future. And Andrew, as Andrew just mentioned, we can't predict what's going to happen, but what do we think we can infer from the data that we've gathered so far? To kick things off, I have a question for Alex. One thing that we've observed, and one change in post-COVID life that I imagine everyone on this webinar has experienced is the increase in work from home. Can you talk a little bit about how that's affected housing choices and how we expect that to change housing choices in the future?
Yeah, so I think that this is all super speculative right now. You know, I think there's a lot of anecdote and not a lot of data. And I do want to say that I think a lot of, I think the work from home thing is going to be interesting for reasons I'll get into, but I think right now a lot of people are sort of putting their own experiences onto things, in part because like that's what we have right now, right? Is like all of what we're experiencing in this process. I did, hear that census data is not going to be fully out to states until September at this point. That's where we start, really seeing information about household size and trips and stuff like that. And so we're not going to have that for a while. So I do want to just, assert that a lot of this stuff is speculative. So it feels like, on one hand, you've got sort of like, decline of cities, death of cities, like why would you live in a city like when you can move into the middle of nowhere and work for wherever, which is a sort of recurring theme that comes up every time there's a sort of technological leap. I think what will be particularly interesting is how stable neighborhoods are. And this goes back to just like conventional smart growth stuff, right? Is that people like to be within walking distance of amenities, schools that they consider good, neighborhoods that they consider safe, which are all really loaded terms and come with a lot of prejudice and backstory and stuff like that. But fundamentally, I think you're going to see a sort of like demand for larger work from home friendly spaces in neighborhoods that are somewhat well established. On the other hand, work from home has risen for like people like us on this call who are able to be at home and working. Essential workers are still taking transit. People are still riding transit. People are still working at the grocery store. They're working at your pharmacies. They're working at daycare centers, right? Like they're working in medical offices. There's lots of people who are still existing in the world in a way that looks a little bit more like pre-COVID than it does for us. And I do want to be mindful of that, it's easy to throw our hands up. People don't want to live in cities. Nobody's riding transit, but that's not true. It may be less. It may not be, the sort of hard charging economic development driven kind of thing that we want to see from ridership or like marquee transit projects, but people are still there. They're still using these things that we have built. And it's so frustratingly ignorant to sort of say that like, oh, like no one's using this and we're, the entire world is going to change. So I think, on my end, I do a lot of work on land use and trying to especially increase residential density in affluent neighborhoods in DC. That's a lot of what my work is. And I spend a lot of time with land use codes, like the comp plan or the zoning code, to see where the holdup with that is, because I expect that stuff it's already expensive and it's just going to get more expensive. And as we sort of, are on these two tracks of like K-shaped recovery, if you want to say that like people who are going to work from home can afford to accommodate their preferences in a particular way, that just takes attention away from the fact that like, I do think that the public sector should be providing people the opportunity to live dignified lives. And we need to pay attention to that.
Thank you, Alex. You actually led right into my next question, which was highlighting the fact that, certainly not, there are a lot of people who don't work in offices and don't have the choice to work from home. But I think the shift of people commuting may change a little bit because a lot of surveys that we've seen have indicated that people who are currently working from home under COVID would like to continue working from home at least part of the time. So knowing that and knowing that there are still many people who have to commute out of their homes, how do we think that's going to affect travel patterns throughout the region post-COVID? And Alex, of course, you're welcome to elaborate, but I'd like to open this question up to others.
Yeah. If I could actually shape this a little bit, though, I would love it if we could talk about trips that are not just commutes, because people have to move around for things that are that are different than just going to work.
I was going to mention a different type of trip, which is the sometimes called brown truck delivery, like UPS and Amazon and FedEx, which haunts the streets near my work from home location. I think that that was already a trend that was going on, that people were ordering more online and then receiving goods in their home, and that's like skyrocketed. And conversely, Uber and Lyft kind of melted away. And I think a lot of those things are gonna change back. I think like you said, Alex, I think the idea that everybody's gonna now work from home forever is a little overblown. But it's hard to say exactly how. I will say one of the most popular things that we've done is a streetery program. Everybody loves to have cafes out in the street. Definitely keep doing that. I don't know, we'll see how we get forward with that, but that's been a super popular program and I think a really good use of space. And there's, especially with all of these programs, I think in some cases, a lot of people already wanted those things like sidewalk extensions, which I mentioned. The most successful sidewalk extensions are places where we probably should just widen the sidewalk, period, un-COVID related, and same thing with streeteries. People want to sit in a cafe outside on a nice street, and we should make that possible normally.
So I'll jump in. In the before times, like we had something called the Friday fall off, right? And so literally in this region, we were a 4-day a week commute pattern because so many work for the Fed, so many people were able to do that alternative work schedule or, work from home 1 day a week and had that flexibility. So, we've been working a lot with our jurisdictions, the bids, the like Board of Trade, that sort of thing, as well as surveying customers to understand. And to whomever pointed out, I think there is a desire to get back to a bit of pre-COVID normalcy in terms of going to work, right? Is it every day? Is that flexibility now built in? So a lot of the stuff we're doing is like scenario planning, like gaming it out. Like, all right, if it's 3 days a week, do we, what kind of passes do we need? Like, how do we set that up? But to Alex's point about the non-commute trip, I mean, that's really where, if we're able to do less in the peak period, but keep the same amount of service, like we can spread it out during the off-peak, midday, later, the weekend, the elbow, post-work trip, and that way have a better level of service so that it is actually an option for people to take, even if it's not the typical commute trip. So that's one of the things that we're talking about, of how if we're able to bring down the peak bit, but we're able to reallocate that service elsewhere, that then means we can bring up the off-peak service.
If I can jump in here. Oh,
sorry. Yeah, just a quick point that it's also, people are eager to get back to normal, but it also depends on how government and how cities plan for that. If they're going to encourage people to, their staff to work more from home, then those patterns are going to change. If not, they're not going to change. They're going to go back to what it was. If cities are going to plan more biking infrastructure, then people are going to be encouraged to bike more and be outside more. If cities are going to widen and keep widening their sidewalks, then the street trees are going to be continue to be there. So there's an important aspect here, how cities are responding to these momentums and keeping them. This will also impact what stays and how things change.
I was going to add that for what Allison was saying about the kind of the shifts over the week in Montgomery County, we have had, you know, a pretty dramatic fall off in ridership, but our fall off in ridership on buses was much more so on weekdays than on weekends. So our weekend percentage decline in ridership was not as extreme. And, you know, we don't know exactly why that is, but perhaps some of that is the loss of trip chaining with work. Perhaps some of that is people who are working from home now go out, still use the bus on the weekends to go perform trips that they would have done, or perhaps they're still doing those types of activities. Yeah. Oh, and one other thing that hasn't been mentioned that at least in Montgomery County is a very relevant topic is parking. So we have had many people in our urban centers. We have 3 areas where we have parking lot districts where the county runs public parking lots and garages, Wheaton, Rockville, and Bethesda. Sorry, Wheaton, Silver Spring, and Bethesda. And many of those locations, it's free to park overnight. And so all of a sudden when people were teleworking, it's like they didn't have the free car storage during the day where they normally work. So there was a lot, we had heard from many people who all of a sudden were faced with paying for parking, whereas normally they park for free during the day at work and park in the parking lot districts for free overnight. And so initially we had 1 free garage designated in each of the districts to, you know, try to help people in this upheaval, but we have started charging in all of our garages and lots now. And so we are getting inquiries. And so that's just been a new challenge for the public, or change, let's say.
I want to give Heidi a chance to speak because I've seen you've unmuted your mic a couple of times, but after that, I do want to put a pin in this conversation because I have another question that I want to get to.
Thank you, Sheila. Yeah, I think Allison and others have raised the point about commute versus other trips. And I also wanted to add the dichotomy, I guess, of urban versus suburban and rural. So I know this is APBP DC, and a lot of the panelists might be from urban jurisdictions, but wanted to highlight that traffic volumes and mode share and different things are going to look different between urban and suburban and rural. So I know Andy in his presentation flashed a slide about traffic volumes, and it showed things being down 50% and things like that. But according to what I've seen, traffic volumes for commute, non-commute, peak, off-peak are getting very close to what they were pre-pandemic, especially in outer jurisdictions, a little less so for Arlington, due to their denser, more multimodal environment. But, I wouldn't underestimate the fact that traffic volumes are rising in the outer jurisdictions, and that we as a region are all very linked as to where people are traveling. For the most part, people live and work in sometimes very different areas. And overall, for post-COVID, I wouldn't underestimate the growth. Possibly, obviously we don't know, but there's still growth in the region as far as people moving here, job growth, population growth. So, that's something to consider, that there's still growth happening.
Thank you so much for providing that other perspective as well. I do want to say that we're going to come back to this idea of work trips versus non-work trips and suburban versus urban environments. But I want to take a second to take advantage of the fact that we have Lauren here from APS. APS has always been really proactive and progressive in terms of your focus on non-motorized transportation to school. And I'm curious what you think that APS will be doing differently in the future post-COVID in terms of transportation or school transportation.
Well, I think we really are hoping to continue to use the momentum from people being of necessity out on foot and bicycling during this time, and also having to do so much more online, and therefore wanting to be outside more and getting more physical activity as a part of their getting around, to kind of capture that and spread it a little wider. Traditionally within the school division and teaching, it's been in health and PE that we teach about transportation safety and so on. But what we've been able to do is get a little creative and spread some of these essential lessons about the benefits of active transportation to other areas of curriculum for teachers who are looking for ways to get their kids, their students out of offline, but doing things that were kind of supporting what they're trying to teach, whether it was math and science or just doing civics, anything that could kind of build in the engagement that goes along with the active transportation kind of teaching opportunities. But the other part is like, really, if we can continue the with expanded walk zones, or with requiring a park and walk rather than the idea of dropping off on campus, doing things that make these necessities become just the routine. And I think a lot of people have actually, we have not gone back to school yet. We will be in a couple of weeks, and it'll be a phased in period, but we'll be trying to the extent possible to operationalize and make permanent a lot of the changes that we kind of secretly wanted, that we can turn into, well, we did it during COVID and it didn't kill us. And you know what? Your kids are outside a little more, and you're not polluting, and you're not stressed out driving, and the buses are running more efficiently. So, hey, let's just keep that momentum going. So.
That sounds like pretty incredible work. Thank you, Lauren. So we are running out of time a little bit because I want to leave time for an audience question and answer. So I'm going to ask a question that's fairly broad, which is, what do you think COVID means for the future of multimodal transportation planning? Going back to this idea of looking at work trips versus non-work trips, or historically, we've always focused on the impacts of transportation planning, particularly on peak hours. What sorts of other data do you think that we're going to use to inform our decisions? And what sort of priorities do you think what we've learned from this period will allow us to focus more on in the future?
I can launch into one thing that I think is kind of cool about what happened in DC. We have on a lot of our principal arterials, our major roadways, what we call peak hour restricted parking, meaning during peak hour, there's an extra lane for travel. Off peak, say on the inbound AM rush side, there's parking, right, in the rest of the time. And during COVID, during the lockdown, or ever since, I guess, March, we have suspended peak hour parking restrictions, meaning there's kind of just an overnight road diet, zero planning, no additional anything. Like, we didn't do any other changes to fit with that. It was just like, boom, you can just stay parked there. And this is kind of seen as like a thing, like, A, we don't have the bandwidth to enforce it, and B, people aren't going to work anymore and they may want to leave their car there all day. Let's make it easier for everybody. And the peak is gone, right? So we didn't need it so much. And I think that we're still looking at kind of what happened then. I'd say, for one thing, the sky hasn't fallen. A lot of our traffic on some of those arterials is back up because, as Heidi mentioned, and depending on some areas, we have more people who are still working in person, just because of the nature of their jobs. And so even with traffic pickup, it's still functioning. And we're looking at the safety impacts because we believe that there will be a positive safety impact of those, even those completely unplanned road diets. And that's something I think that is really important, because to provide space, more space for people walking, people biking, transit to be more reliable and speedy through bus lanes and other things, we need space. We need space on the street. We're very constrained on space on the street. So if we can take that space back from private vehicles, particularly rush hour, then it'll be a big deal.
We've been working with the district to roll out bus lanes, right? To get the red paint down now while there's less traffic, and that way we've claimed that space before whenever it comes back, and like in whatever form. So that's something that we've been working with lots of Linda's colleagues on, and we really support that. We're open to working with any of the other jurisdictions that we operate in, but that's definitely been our kind of focus of how do we claim the space that we've wanted, or and not just like we for transit, but to Linda's point, for biking, for bike lanes. I saw that we just put down a walk lane somewhere in the district. At least that's what Twitter has told me. So nice blue. Yeah, there you go. And it looked great from that photo. But the like taking that space back where we can now, and not waiting and fighting that battle, because it's not going to be pretty.
I was maybe from a different angle. You talked about the data, and this is very interesting. Years ago in transportation planning, we based things on commute trips because that's the data we had. Census, journey to work trip, this kind of thing. There are emerging data sources now, and some promising things. Maybe there needs to be a little bit more maturity in that field, particularly from the vendors, and maybe a little bit more transparency of what data that you're getting you mean over time. But this is very promising, because if we can get more different kinds of data about different trip purposes, about different modes and so forth, we can make a more fully informed recommendation or decisions among our elected officials on what projects and programs to proceed with.
I think that COVID has really brought bicycle and pedestrian travel and the need for, I guess, all kinds of people to get out and bike and walk, even if they didn't before COVID. I think that kind of conversation has come to the forefront during COVID at all levels of government and decision making. So I do think that post-COVID, that will stay both in people's minds and in transportation planning practices. I think that the volumes that we've seen on bike trails, the really, really crazy volume changes, increases in some areas of biking and walking, does prove the point that people want to and need to get out there in these large volumes to bike and walk. So I think that will be on people's minds and in people's plans for the future. That being said, I think a lot of things, and I'm just trying to focus on bike ped right now, not necessarily all other modes, but that being said, there are a lot of things that were in the works pre-COVID to do with enhanced biking and walking that have continued and will continue, that just happened during COVID. COG-TPB's National Capital Trail Network was adopted last year. So that kind of sets a framework for building out a really great complete network of biking and walking facilities. VDOT's safety countermeasures across the state for increasing safety at crosswalks and adding rectangular rapid flashing beacons. That was already happening and in the works, but it's gonna kind of coincide with COVID era, getting more safety improvements on our high crash roadways. So some things are already happening, some things are gonna be really enhanced, I think, in planning conversations. But overall, I'm really glad to see that. And one last point, Sheila, I know you're probably trying to move on, but I did want to share one stat from the VDOT DRPT commuter survey about attitudes towards bicycling. Most of the respondents in Northern Virginia said that they, about their attitude towards bicycling, that their attitude didn't change. They're going to keep bicycling. But 26% of Northern Virginia respondents said that they're actually going to bike more, and biking is more appealing. So that's a quarter of Northern Virginia survey respondents that said, definitively they're more attracted to it. And I think one of the contributing factors has been fewer cars on the road and more telework. So more teleworking equals better for bicycling. Thank you.
I was just going to add one more thing about from the school and family perspective that really, I think one value added, if you can say that, out of the pandemic is that by having more time to fill from a family perspective and having, finite amounts of time on the computer doing things for school, but needing to get your kids out and also wanting them to get out, it reinforced the life skills that come with figuring out navigating your own environment from the ground up. And I think parents who have been able to adapt to that, who are either working from home or maybe will continue to work from home, are going to try to keep doing that. And that's only going to help. And I think the kids have benefited from it. And if anything, it'll reverse engineer and influence the parents to do less driving and more walking and biking and trying to do what's sustainable as well as what's in most cases more efficient. So.
Well, if no one else has any closing remarks, I'd just like to say thank you all so much. I think this has been a really enriching conversation. I feel like I could talk to each of you for at least an hour individually. So right now, I'm going to pass the mic to my colleague, Jim Elliott, who will be sharing some of our audience questions.
Hey, we have some really great questions that have come in from the audience. I'm going to start with one that relates to something that Siba mentioned about the ability of governments and organizations to shape the post-pandemic future. The question is, what are the various agencies on the panel doing, if anything, to encourage private businesses to continue work from home policies that are beneficial to improving the environment and reducing congestion?
I'll start. We have in Montgomery County, we have a group called Commuter Services, which was already dedicated to that type of effort in encouraging telework and reducing single occupancy vehicle trips. So they are, although we are nearly a year into the pandemic, they're still hosting free webinars, encouraging, trying to help employers continue to navigate telework more smoothly and improve the process and get the word out about their programs that already existed prior to the pandemic, financial, funding opportunities to support work from home. Something that I didn't hear in kind of the closing statements that I would have added is that, we have huge budget challenges ahead of us. And probably everyone in this conversation does, and employers have that also. So I'm really hopeful that we're able to preserve our incentive programs to reduce the reliance on a traditional commute trip. But that's all of our programs face, a lot of stress from our budget situation.
That's a really good point. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, I mean, TDM programs are pretty big in our region. Virginia works with, or VDOT works with DRPT and COG on actually funding a telework outreach program where consultants call up businesses. It's a little different now in COVID, but they work with businesses to set up telework programs and get more employees teleworking, as well as carpooling and other modes. But Commuter Connections at COG is a big program that aids in that, and all local jurisdictions in our region work with their state and region to help facilitate that. I think it's a lot easier now, probably because a lot of metrics have probably been met with the number of businesses teleworking, but yeah, it's a big effort for sure.
I guess if I could jump in, Jim, and thanks for the good mentions of COG's Commuter Connections and our, multi-decade history of promoting alternatives, including telework. But in terms of the gist of the question is, what are we doing to tell employers to encourage more teleworking? Is not what I'm hearing, from my seat. It's more like, what can we do to have our region's economy recover from the impacts of COVID, whether it be the employment, the other economic activities, and I think that's top of mind. And everyone, I think everyone realizes that telework is a part of it, but having max telework and min traffic is not the end of the list of the problems that the region is trying to solve. So that's something to keep in mind. We got to think of a lot of other aspects of the impacts of COVID, from the COG perspective in all these different sectors.
Did anybody else want to jump in on this question? And maybe we could broaden it a bit to thinking about how organizations are shaping the post-pandemic future in multiple ways, not just through encouragement of telework. And Siba, if you have any good examples from other countries, we'd love to hear them as well.
I mean, we've been surveying a lot of our customers and, like I said, the bids and, that sort of thing, employers as well. And then working, Greater Washington Partnership has surveyed, Board of Trade has surveyed. So and I think actually COG did a survey as well. So really trying to learn, what is it that what are people's concerns with taking transit? Because honestly, like if they're not taking transit, like our operating budget is what the jurisdictions pay and our revenues from fares. Like it's those two things combined it's our operating budget. And so the lower we have from fares, the more we need from the jurisdiction. So or the service cuts that we see, right? So like that's how it all kind of comes together. So we've really been, thinking about, so understanding like from a cleaning and like what do we need to be kind of getting out there in terms of telling people how it works and like what we're doing, but then also thinking about, all right, when it is safe to come back, like how do we welcome people back? Is it like free fare day? Do we, like how do you kind of start? Because coming back, I mean, I don't know about any of you, but when I've gone out because I've been working from home since last March. When I've gone out and you see a lot of people, it is kind of like stressful, right? So being able to welcome people back and encourage them to continue to ride transit is kind of where we are. So.
Okay, anybody else want to jump in on this one?
I'd say, I think Allison mentioned this earlier, but just the bus lane work that we're doing just to try and take that space and dedicate it for bus, it's speeding up and making bus travel more reliable in key corridors. And we have, those are quick build projects where we just pretty much put in markings, the red paint, etc. But you can see in Allison's virtual background. But the other thing is we're building a big new transitway on K Street, which is a key kind of hub and employment center in the district, which will make a huge difference, I think, for bus travel through the downtown area, which is really critical. So all those things we've been able to progress to a large extent on time or better in some cases. I think the thing that's been hard for us is do public outreach because you can't do in-person things. We have done outreach anyway as time progressed, but at first it was pretty much none, et cetera, because of the need to focus the district's messaging around the public health emergency. But that's probably, the construction has, if anything, sped up on a lot of the things we were already trying to go in that direction, basically of promoting and making it easier and safer and more inviting to use other modes besides driving solo to get into the districts.
I was just going to add to with Arlington, we were very fortunate to already have some advisory committees and some group efforts that have been undertaken with our county colleagues in transportation and the police and crossing guards and so on. But when this need came up for us to reopen schools and to do so in a way that was going to we didn't know how it was going to play out, honestly, but for everyone who stepped up, Department of Parks and Recreation, volunteers, citizens advisory committees, all sorts of different elements of the community who recognize not only that schools are such an important part of the community and that our young people need to be safe, but that any improvements we could make as a result of this for our schools would also benefit the community. It's not like those sidewalks are only used by students or those intersections only need to be safe for students. So I think there was a real groundswell of support and more working relationships. We already had a good foundation, but even more came out of this. So I think unlike the silos in some places, we really managed to improve what was already a pretty solid foundation. So that's been very beneficial.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for your responses to that question. Now I want to move on to a question that relates to something that Heidi mentioned, related to the commuter survey, the increasing interest in bicycling coming out of the pandemic. So we had a question that is about that. Question is, I work in DC and we're trying to organize and encourage active transportation now, every day, and when we all start coming back into the office regularly. We expect many more bike commuters, even when we get back part-time. And we are wondering about the capacity of bike share, bike parking, bike-friendly routes. How can we be safe? This is really a question about what's being done to accommodate this expected increase in demand for bicycling.
I'll take a stab at that. We are rapidly expanding our protected bike lane network. And as I said, the construction that went forward in 2020 was actually probably ahead of schedule. I think we put in about 6 miles total of new bike facilities. And we expect to probably increase that in 2021. Our construction season starts in about a month-ish, depending on the weather. And so we'll be getting going on some of those. They're already planned and designed and ready to go in. So that said, we are looking carefully at all the safety aspects, especially of our connections and trying to improve things, particularly with some of our federal partners. Since I see that he's a federal employee, we do have federal partners we have to work with for specific routes through National Park Service lands, which are really key connections for many employment centers. So I'm trying to keep working on it.
Thank you, Linda. Anybody else? Okay, well, picking up on something that Linda mentioned earlier, you were talking about the increased number of deliveries in your neighborhood. And, you know, I think one of the effects of COVID has been the rise in e-commerce and deliveries. There's a question about curbside management and the management of curb space. How have curb space management needs changed, or do you expect them to change during and after the pandemic?
I can take a quick stab at that, and I hope other people are also working on this because it's such a key issue, right? I think pre-pandemic, we were talking a lot about how we need to systematize and expand the curb space, both for kind of quick turnaround goods delivery, like Amazon, UPS, et cetera, and for passenger pickup and drop off in neighborhoods where we're seeing a lot of Uber and Lyft use, just to improve the safety, because those are such temporary uses. We often see people with DoorDash or whatever, they just pull over, double park, leave their car running, leave the keys in it. In some case, somebody's car got stolen doing that. I was like, okay, don't leave your keys in your car. Pro tip. Anyway, whatever, it's not a good story, also cause a crash. But anyway, so we have been looking at expanding that already. And I think that this is just kind of putting more pressure on that. I didn't mention before, I should have mentioned, very early on, we created an emergency no parking zone for pickup and drop off for food delivery in front of, like any business basically could apply for those and put them in just with signs overnight pretty much. And that was an extremely successful program. And I think last I checked, we had over 130 of those across the district in all different business areas. And those have been really successful. I think we'll probably expand because we already had a pickup and drop off zone program that was a fraction of that. And that big multiplication, I think, is showing us where some of the demand might be.
Okay, thanks, Linda. Does anybody else want to comment about curbside management?
I guess I'll interject that, thanks to the, especially encouragement from DDOT, we've had some regional meetings and discussions on the topic of curbside management. It certainly is a fledgling area, even before the pandemic. And, I'm thinking one of the changes, at least temporary during the pandemic, is the rise and the fall of the transportation network companies, the Uber and Lyfts of the world, and what challenges they were bringing to the curbside. And if a generation ago we were thinking about mainline capacity as the transportation planning issue, I think curbside is maybe the transportation planning issue of our generation. There are just so many demands on that space, especially with mixed use, multifamily dwellings. You have the freight uses, you have the pickup and drop off uses, you have vending, you have recreation, and of course the old-fashioned car storage parking demands from folks. This is especially true in the more dense, urban environments in our region. Our members, way out in the far reaches of the rural areas of our outer counties aren't talking about this as much, but where it's important, it's very important, and I think it's going to continue to be a challenge, pandemic and after.
All right, thank you, Andrew.
I'll add that in our one interesting change is through our shared streets program, where we facilitated outdoor dining. When the pandemic was just, hitting, and we were exploring concepts of how we could support businesses, we also, like Linda said, implemented curbside pickup zones very quickly. I think March 17th, they went into place, so very early on. But when we looked at actually supporting outdoor dining, the initial reaction from some representatives of the community was the standard, you can't touch parking, the businesses are hurting, can't lose their parking. And the attitude really changed around that. And businesses were, it just wasn't a problem. In most cases, there was no resistance to taking away parking to facilitate closing down a street. We did our areas, we actually, for outdoor dining, in most areas, we just closed down the entire street or a portion of a street, not just the parking lane. And the traditional, who we would expect to be opponents to that, it wasn't an issue.
Thank you, Hannah, and thanks to all of our panelists. We really appreciate you joining us today and appreciate everybody's questions. We didn't get to all of them, although I think we got to most of them. So thanks for submitting those questions. So now I'm going to turn it over to Aditya to close us out. Wendy, can you share your screen again?
Thanks, Jim, and thanks again to all our panelists and attendees. I think we had a great session. Just a quick plug-in on APBP. If you are not already a member, please consider becoming a member. We have great resources on the website. Do check out apbp.org. And again, thank you very much. I'm glad we were able to cover all the topics and listen to kind of a variety of panelists and all the things that different agencies and organizations are doing. Hopefully 2021 turns out much better than 2020 and we're able to do these events in person again. So thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Thanks all.
Happy long weekend.
Yeah.
Am I good to end it, Jim?
Yeah, I think you're good, Phil.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Wow.
Thank you. Bye.